good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from around the world. We are thrilled, delighted to have with us Damien Atkins, a General Counsel for the Hershey Company. Yeah, the guys who make the chocolates, that's right. So we're thrilled to have him, and we appreciate everybody joining us to talk about Black Lives Matter, dismantling systemic racism. So it is a interesting, very current subject, and we are delighted that Damien can join us. So let me give you a little bit of Damien's background, and Damien, please feel free to interject. So Damien got his undergraduate degree from Stanford, then went to NYU Law. He's had numerous leadership positions in companies that I'm sure all of you are aware of. Chief Compliance Officer for AOL, General Counsel for Panasonic, and now General Counsel for the Hershey Company. So welcome to Pandemic Punditry, Damien. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Lavi. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, it's great to see you again. It's been a really long time.
Yeah.
But so, I mean, Damien, one of the things that, that Karthik and I, we were doing some research to make sure that, we stayed current with all the numbers and what's going on in the US and around the world where Black Lives Matter was concerned. And it actually, to be honest, it was actually rather depressing. I mean, having lived in the US for many years, I always thought, obviously I knew there was this systemic racism there. I a couple of occasions actually experienced it myself, but I didn't understand quite the degree and the institutionalization of that racism till actually I started reading up on it dramatically for this particular conversation with you. So, that stunned me. I mean, I remember, working on the first campaign for Obama's first campaign. I volunteered, and I couldn't make it to the inauguration. It was a very, very cold day in Washington, and
it was freezing that day.
Yeah, it was freezing, if you remember, right?
Yeah, it was
and
freezing.
So we had all these. My next door neighbor had all of us. There was, I think, about 15, 20 people who watched it live, and they were from, it was a very diverse group of people from all over the world, from various religions, from the U.S. Also. So it was quite a diverse group of people. And I remember at his inauguration, there was not one dry eye in that room. I mean, we were just so moved. And I was thinking, from Jim Crow to having President Barack Obama, I mean, what a huge transformation, that was. And you heard him speak yesterday at John Lewis's eulogy, and he was talking about, counting the jelly beans, the literacy test for voting. And you had this huge, I mean, I thought, yeah, after that, everything's going to be great. I mean, finally, we're going to get rid of this whole problem. And, that's really hasn't transpired. So initial thoughts for you on what's going on there and on this whole movement? I mean, what are your, personal feelings on this matter?
Yeah, it's, I will say it's kind of, I've gone through the various stages of kind of acknowledgement and acceptance. I think what initially happened, I was, I'm 50 years old now, and I was like, oh, here we go again. I remember Rodney King, and I remember Michael Brown, and just the number of times that something like this has happened, at least in my lifetime, and then within living memory, we go through cycles. This happens, there's protests, there's anger, there's a lot of speeches, and then nothing happens. I think this particular moment in time has been different, I think, because of, if you look at, people have a lot more time on their hands with very few distractions. You have, with COVID-19, everyone's kind of locked in at home, or no one's in the office. There are no, in the United States, there were no sports. There are no children's activities, so people are pretty homebound. And images like George Floyd's death, things about the Amy Cooper incident in Central Park, New York, have a much wider audience than normal. And when you have events like this that strike a chord that are just humanly painful to watch, but then there are no other distractions, it takes a much larger mind share around the community. So I think that has changed. Or you might otherwise be worried about taking your child to a baseball game, or you're worried about watching, you're doing something at work. You're at home, so you couldn't escape it. So, the magnitude of what has been going on for a very long time hit everyone at the same time with no distractions. So I think that is what makes it different. And then you see the impact it has had on people in the country. Where I live, there are now Black Lives Matter signs in my neighbor's windows. And I would say, there aren't many, I'm in a suburb of New York. Um, I don't have one of those signs in my windows, but seeing neighbors who are not black with these signs in their windows and children marching and demonstrating, I was kind of in shock, right? Because something is clearly here different here. I think the last thing, if you can't overestimate the impact of technology. The widespread use of camera phones has really made it much easier and faster to actually document things that have been going on in the United States for since its inception.
Mhm.
But they've all been spreading it by word of mouth or covered up because it can only spread by word of mouth. But now with the power of that cell phone, whoever invented the cell phone camera, they talk about unintended consequences. You can videotape it, and then with the internet, you can just upload it onto a YouTube page or a Facebook page or a Twitter page, and you get instantaneous one-to-many communication. So you can document what's going on and then spread and distribute what's going on instantaneously. That's changed everything considerably.
Yeah, and what's sort of I think also what has changed is maybe because of the pandemic and all of us are sort of glued to the news to hear about what's going on globally where the pandemic is concerned. I think there's been a global awareness and acknowledgement of what's going on. And so, stepping, being outside of the U.S., it's clear. I mean, whether it's Sri Lanka, most Americans have never heard of the place, or India, or anywhere else in the world. I mean, even the UK is having protests, right? I mean, everybody sort of understood the impact and essentially is tuned in and keen to find out, want to know more, what's happening and what's going on. I think, yes, I think like your neighbors who put up, Black Lives Matter signs in a very tony neighborhood of Westchester, I think, globally people are now watching this with sort of much more focused attention than just a passing news item. I don't know whether you've sort of living in the U.S. see that, but from our standpoint where we are, I mean, certainly it's in the headlines here as well.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I think you hit on a great point. It's become more of a global phenomenon. Typically, these things are very local in nature. Something happens in Houston, it kind of stays in Houston. Something happens in New York, for the most part, it stays in New York. It might get a little more national attention, but this is something that happened in Minneapolis that 5 years ago would have just been a local news story that died out in 3 days. But again, with the power of the internet and everyone on a global lockdown, you're right, it's had a much larger global impact. Typically, things that have a large global impact would be things involving presidential politics or war and peace or something like that, but not something that was, I mean, I hate to say it this way, but is a not irregular occurrence on the streets of Minneapolis. Now everyone can see it. I was shocked to see protests around the world over something like this. And it speaks to, I grew up overseas a lot of my life. I grew up outside of the United States. And one thing you became aware of as a child is that, that there's an image of America as kind of the land of the free, the land of opportunity. And I think that over time, again, with the power of the internet and the power of mobile phones, that image, the contrast with the image and kind of the day-to-day reality has kind of struck a chord globally. Which I kind of saw it myself, but now seeing it at scale because of this has been tremendous. And I don't want to speak for you or folks outside the United States, but it's kind of one of these things where my sense of it is, so you're no different than anywhere else. They're the similar type of problems in every country in the world. The United States is no different.
That's also been a function of the pandemic, right? Because we've seen, the U.S., today is 150,000 plus deaths, and the systems, creaking under the load of the pandemic, and that's a worldwide phenomenon. I mean, if the richest and most advanced country supposedly in the world can't handle it, then that's it's been a great equalizer in more ways than one. So
That's right.
It's very sort of interesting juxtaposition of two very distinct things. Systemic racism and the pandemic, and I think there are places where the two meet. I'd like to throw up a couple of sort of data points to sort of back up what you're talking about, and also for the benefit of the listeners today and the viewers today. And so I think interestingly, what we are seeing here, which is I don't know whether everybody can see it now. So there is, a tremendous amount of support. It seems 67% of the people express support for the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And it obviously started in 2013, 13 July, when Trayvon Martin's killer was let out, was not charged. So I think and then all the way to George Floyd on the 25th of May, we've had this sort of tremendous sort of groundswell of people largely supporting. Of course, the racial divisions are quite clear, but 67% overall seems to be very cognizant of the value of the Black Lives Movement. And also, I think what we found interesting was that, and to see, to echo something that you said, 7 in 10 Americans have had conversations about race in the past month, right? And 85% of whites now say that they have a person they consider a fairly close friend. And that's up 54% from 1981, right? So does this talk to the sort of coming together of the races across? Maybe the new generation of millennials and younger folk are integrating more, having conversations more with people of different races in the U.S. Is this something that backs that up? You think that's happening?
Yes, I thought the data is fascinating to me. I think you hit on a really important point. The world that, call it, people 35 and under grew up in is very different than the world that someone my age grew up in.
Right.
They take cell phones for granted, they take the internet for granted, and at least in the United States, you have a much more diverse. If you look at the millennial generation and the generation beneath, younger than millennials, it's probably the most racially diverse, generation in American history. So I think that has a tremendous influence on the attitudes and the data that you have. I think the other thing that's fascinating is that if you look at kind of the Black Lives Matter movement, from my understanding, it started, kind of with the death of Michael Brown. It was really considered somewhat of a fringe, kind of a fringe thing, and now it's become, much more mainstream. And I think a lot of that is, if you look at the people who've, quote unquote, come of age over the last 5 to 10 years, that has been part of their reality, so to speak. Someone my age and older, the first source of news, for at least for us growing up, was the TV. We might have 2 channels, but these kids are much more connected. Their friend, but how they view their friends and relationships is radically different than something I grew up with, when I was coming up. So yeah, absolutely. I think what you're seeing here is, again, the power of the internet, the power of technology, and then the generational change in attitudes and experiences. If you talk to, talk to my children, my daughter's 11, her whole worldview on race and gender is just radically different than my view might have been at 11. It's just, I grew up in an environment that was, it's kind of your traditional American, Black, white, Latino, Asian, and everyone kind of stuck to kind of their own little groups, except for in the workplace. Now it's just tremendously different. Taste in music is radically different. So that data to me reflects kind of those generational shifts. And as these groups of folks kind of come of age and enter the workforce and start voting, you'll see more gender shifts as well. It's so shocking to me.
Yeah, I also, had put up there a slide from Will Smith who talked about that, that racism has really never sort of gone up or down. It's just been filmed, which was your point, right? So, and he made that comment in 2016, right? Mm-hmm. In the middle of the Obama administration as well. So it's interesting. There's a lot of data, and happy to show some as well, where, the whole quantum of sort of the amount of racism, the police brutality that we are seeing, that a lot of people are talking about, is quite significant. And it was certainly an eye opener for me, when I came across this data. So as the Will Smith comment, because if you look at this, the perception, if you look at the, it's the lines are pretty flat, and this is from 2015, right? So police killings, which are about 1,000 a year, haven't substantially changed, irrespective of the president in charge or the party in power, right? It's been a consistently sort of a bad situation for African Americans historically, for it seemed like at least for 5-6 years from this data. And then I think there's a sort of a discordant shift because, maybe has a lot to do with accountability, right? So this is another staggering statistic that I found, that 99% of the killings by police from 2013 to 2019 has not been resulted in any sort of officer being charged with a crime, right? This is one conviction. And that's just a, that's just, I mean, you wonder why people are reacting the way they're reacting, because if you see this, I mean, that would make anybody pretty upset, I would think. Damien,
Yeah,
what
it's a
do you
very
think?
complicated problem. It's interesting. I mean, I'd even question the data that there's about 1,000 people killed by law enforcement per year. There's not one central repository, so a lot of the people
That's right.
collecting that
Right.
data are kind of doing it piecemeal for either word of mouth or investigative reporting. So I'm not even sure if that number is actually right. I do
I think a lot
think
of people,
that,
yeah, a lot of people think it's more. Yeah, correct.
yeah, I do think that, particularly in the United States, it's different. It's a heavily armed society. That's just kind of part of the culture.
Hmm.
So, you're going to have, just by definition, a lot more people carrying weapons on the streets. And that kind of creates and helps feed kind of a culture of policing that we have in the United States, where, self-protection and officer safety is paramount. And when you have a lot of guns on the streets and you have officers with weapons, a lot of countries, police officers don't carry weapons for the most part. You're going to get situations like this.
Right.
In terms of kind of punishment for at the hands of police deaths, I mean, that is something that that I believe the data there is correct. That goes to kind of the culture of, one respect for police officers that we have in the United States, that if a police officer feels that his or her life is in danger, they have to make split-second decisions with a very heavily armed populace. And who are we to guess and second judge the actions in those cases? So it's very hard, as a lawyer, it's very hard to say that someone who we've imbued with public trust, who has to make split-second decisions about their own safety or the safety of others, is going to have a guilty mindset. So that's just the way the structure is set up. That said, there are opportunities to improve, right? I mean, this is something that police chiefs around the country have said, that, someone like the guy in Minneapolis, Derek Chauvin, I guarantee everyone in that Minneapolis department knew that he was a problem. If you just look
Yes.
at the number of complaints against him, if you look at the number of incidents that he's had, but somehow he rose to the level of a training officer and, pretty senior person. So, and I think police departments are like any other large organization, right? There are going to be people like that, but what are the systems and institutions and procedures to deal with those problems? I think, in a lot of departments, you have unions have a lot of power and influence to protecting their officers. So you see, someone like that with that large record of disciplinary action still able to be on the streets and training people. When I guarantee the higher ups and a number of people there knew that this person was a problem, it's hard to get rid of cops like that, right? But that's no different. I mean, frankly, in any large organization, if someone, no, it's true, right?
I agree. I know.
Yeah, it's true, right? But I think in particularly when you have a lot of union contracts and a lot of authority of the police unions to make it hard to get rid of people. But punishing police officers for deaths that they may have caused in line of duty. I don't know if the United States is really any different than any other country, quite frankly. It's just something when you imbue someone with the public trust and they're making split decisions, it's hard to say that that person acted with malice intent, unless you look at something like the George Floyd incident, which is kind of indisputable.
Karthik, you had a question for Damien?
Actually, interestingly, I did. Damien, you mentioned when you talked about the police brutality, about how they have to make split-second decisions, and it's possible that the other party could be heavily armed or not. So it sounds like the Black Lives Matter movement and this whole issue of, police brutality and tighter gun control regulations sort of merge here, and the two kind of, negate each other in a certain sense. If you had tighter gun control, blacks wouldn't be as armed and and then they would not be subjected to so much police brutality. Is that a natural thought progression?
Yeah, it's just, like I said, it's a very different society where you have a pretty heavily armed populace. You do, if you just go in the United States, gun ownership, I mean, it's rampant in the country, right? And there's an association with criminality and gun ownership. There's also a thought process where people want to be, Second Amendment rights, I want to protect myself. So just all that stuff comes together where if you're in law enforcement, there are a lot of people on my team who are former law enforcement now. And if you talk to them, and these are, they're good people who mean well, who want to help their communities, that, look, I don't really know if I'm responding to a domestic dispute, there might be 2 or 3 guns in the house, and clearly they're not really, they might not be aimed directed towards me, but you don't know, right? You enter into that enters into the calculus and decision making. So, yes, the high levels of gun ownership here. I don't think in the United States we'll ever get rid of ban guns or ban anything like that. It's just not part of the culture. But it has a tremendous amount of influence on how the country is policed. That said, we do, the policing activity in the country is different depending on location. So, the way, from my personal experience, the way I was, policed, so to speak, growing up in Oakland, California, or when I was in high school in Washington, D.C., is very different than where we're policed now here in Westchester. So that also fades into it, when we talk about the war on drugs, and it became a much more militarized kind of culture versus what it might have been in the 70s. But one of the root causes, I think, is kind of the high levels of gun ownership we have in the United States and the impact that has.
So let's shift gears from sort of the police violence thing. I mean, another sort of statistics is on sort of economic disparity, right? And this graph is sort of staggering from the 1960s. I mean, you can see the median household wealth, right, adjusted for inflation between blacks and whites. I mean, it's a staggeringly huge gap, right? Again, there's obviously something systemic at the core that keeps a large percentage or majority actually of African Americans, in poverty compared to people who are white. I think that's just there is something there that needs fixing, obviously, right, Damien? I mean, what are your thoughts on something like that?
Yeah, that's essentially, I've seen this data in a number of different slices. It can mean a lot of different things. I think the first thing that stands out that there is a legacy. It speaks to the legacy of American history, where for the vast majority of American history, African American and Black labor was really free. Right? It was taken, right? It was taken for free. So you have a large period of time where whatever you do by the product of your own efforts, you're not going to reap the benefits of it, and that accrues over time, right? So if you're working for free for 5 years, and someone else gets all the gains of all your labor, that's going to put you ahead, right? I mean, there's a very simplistic view of it, but I think there's it shows a legacy of that. And I think after from post-slavery through all the way to the 60s, okay, fine, your labor is not being taken from you, the fruits of your labor isn't being taken from you, but I'm not going to let you play in all the various spaces where to actually accumulate wealth, or I'm going to limit those opportunities for you. Again, over time, if you're allowed to, if there's 10 different ways to accumulate wealth or to have an income, but I'm going to let you do all of those 10, but only like in a very small sliver of that, that's going to have an impact as well. So I think, that just speaks to the facts of the legacy of kind of the way American society has been. Also, I think if you look at least in the Black community, and this is true across all races, particularly in the last 30 or 40 years, has been a tremendous amount of kind of income distribution from the bottom up, as well as combining with the changes in the kind of the political economy, where just at the moment, the beginning of desegregation and the Civil Rights Act, the economy changed such that, you used to be able to get a pretty good paying job coming out of high school. You could get a house, you can get 2 cars, and you could have a nice middle class lifestyle. That, no longer the case. Just having a high school job is not going to allow you to kind of move up the economic ladder. So it became, the goalposts moved a bit to be able to get that middle class lifestyle, to be able to accumulate wealth just at the moment that the floodgates open for opportunity, right? So, then, you also have, it also speaks to, how we've invested in educational systems in the United States, particularly since the late 1970s. The tax base for public schools, secondary schools, elementary schools has eroded considerably, and then particularly for higher education as well. So those opportunities.
It's also tied into home ownership, isn't it not? I mean, Damien,
home ownership, exactly.
It's a sort of a main builder of wealth for people in the U.S., right? So ownership,
exactly.
And then that's been sort of systemically sort of blacks have been excluded from that through redlining and all kinds of things, everything from getting loans to everything else. I mean we could take the example of the recent program that the government is running there right now, right? I mean, the PPP program, right? I think that, yeah, I mean, that's, you know, that's has negatively impacted people as well. I mean, there seemed to be a definite bias in that program that obviously is not going to those people that obviously need it really badly. So it's interesting. I think, you know, there are certain sort of, it seems, I mean, does it seem to you, I mean, for us looking at it from this side of the world, it does seem that, you know, there's like an intentional, and maybe it's not intentional, but there seems to be an intentional, almost exclusionary process in place that, you know, I mean, look at the impact of COVID on Black businesses, for example, right? I mean, it's a huge impact, right? And then you look at the fact that, you know, the Paycheck Protection Program, you know, doesn't help small businesses, right? And you know, again, there seem to be the Latino and Black owners of businesses seem to be penalized by the process, right? So I think, you know, there's what is that? I mean, is that actually willful sort of thing, or is that it's always in the system, it's buried in, and nobody's really gone in and plucked it out and sort of fixed it, or is this? I mean, I'm trying to understand this from the perspective of people who are sitting sort of outside the U.S. and obviously you've not been African American. How is this actually happening in your opinion?
Yeah, it's interesting. You're asking the tough questions. I can only, I have no facts necessarily to base my. This is personal opinion, but my personal opinion on this is that, you know, this program was hastily put together, like in call it 3 weeks,
Right.
and they have a bunch of money. They're just going to throw it out there, and the way they distributed it was through, and my understanding is that through certain banks, and the banks would then have leeway to whom to actually receive, who would actually distribute the funds to, and they favored kind of their favorite customers as opposed to the less favorite customers. So if you look at a lot of either African American owned businesses, Latino owned businesses, they tend to be, and again, this is a total generalization, but they tend to be more thinly capitalized. And if you're a loan officer, even though it's a non-recourse loan, whatever else, you're going to go to the people who you've done business with, who you have a longer relationship with. You know, they have, you know, you might even know them, so to speak. You have a relationship with, so they, you know, those kinds of things will then influence who actually gets the money or who gets processed first. I also think, again, it was rushed, so a lot of the technology behind it and how you apply it was kind of a logjam. I have friends here who live in my, community who did receive those loans, but but I have other friends who tried and couldn't get it, and irrespective of race. So I think a lot of that, just the way it was so hastily constructed, had a huge impact on it. And then, the way, the availability of funds was kind of announced and communicated, is not, unless you read the New York Times or your Wall Street Journal, or you're really tied into the news cycle or something, you might not even know. So it wasn't, so it wasn't really publicized as much. And by the time, again, as in the way information travels, a lot of people in these small businesses may have heard about it, but it wasn't really clear how to go apply for it. So it really benefited those people who are already tied into kind of the financial system, who might have known someone who works at a bank or knows someone who worked on it. So I think that has a much larger impact. I don't think there was any kind of intentional saying, oh, we're going to exclude African Americans or exclude Latinos from this. Yeah. It doesn't really work that way. Yeah.
That would be technically illegal, right? But
I think I don't even think it'd be capable of even implementing it. So because it just happens so fast, right?
Yeah. So I mean, of course, women are underrepresented in the Fortune 500, but as a percentage of the population. But in the fact that there's only 3 Black CEOs in the Fortune 500, I mean, it's also pretty telling, right? I mean, at least the women are in a sort of an upward curve as we see it. A long way to go, agreed. But doesn't seem to be much diversity at the top of the food chain either, right? So do you think that contributes a lot to sort of how these banks operate, for example, that, you mentioned the banks. So when we're talking something systemic, right? I mean, it's something that's ingrained. So in the computer systems that disperse it, in the training programs that says, hey, this is for, high, low risk people that, your good clients to get these loans. So, I mean, it's sort of cascades down, right? When you have all of these things sort of built upon a set of criteria or systems that seem to favor a particular profile over another. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think that that does play a part, right? I mean, just looking at the number of female CEOs, it's definitely been an upward trend. There's been a conscious effort, at least the last 15 or 20 years, to increase the number of women CEOs and women's on boards. I mean, very
Right.
successful advocacy on that, and much heightened awareness to the point where,
Yeah.
you know, it is unusual, or people look at you funny if you don't have a lot of women on boards. I think with respect to African Americans on the boards, that is happening as well. And it's gotten, I think I see the same amount of energy towards that as I did towards women, call it 10 or 15 years ago. With respect to CEOs, look, I mean, it's, it's hard job to get, right? It's, there are
Yes.
only, call it, there's 500 of those jobs, Fortune 500 jobs globally. And, a lot of those jobs, there might be a vacancy in 10 in any given year.
Right.
So there's a lot of competition for those jobs. And how do you get part of those networks is, typically those jobs either come from sales, right? Typically a
Right.
sales job or marketing or sometimes in engineering. And if you look at kind of, where the pipeline is and where a lot of the relationships are, you don't see many people of color in those kind of the pipeline for those positions. Um, you know, there have been efforts to kind of increase the pipeline. I do that for the legal profession, do what I can do in the legal profession. But that speaks to the lack of pipeline development. I think there are talented people out there, but not necessarily connected with kind of the key decision makers. For example, and what I do is General Counsel of a public company. There are about 5 to 7 gatekeepers for those kinds of Fortune 500 jobs, but it
Right.
takes a while to understand who those people are. How do you get in front of those people? And that there's a kind of there's informal networks that kind of pass that information and insight down. And I think the same is true for the CEO jobs. There's about 5 to 6 real gatekeepers in the United States, at least. Globally, it's probably a little bit larger, but at least in the United States, there's a few gatekeepers. And not necessarily knowing how to get in front of those gatekeepers and make yourself attractive to those folks is something that, again, it's not racist or anything else, but it is kind of the informal way that power and insight and opportunities are developed in the country.
Yes, I mean, so the job thing is an interesting one. So I understand at the very highest levels, like at the CEO level, that's a very small, obviously boys club, as much as you can, and it's a white boys club. And I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I'm just saying that. And then, this callbacks for whitened resumes. I mean, this is also very telling. I mean, if you were John, you were likely to get in. If you were Jamal, I mean, forget it, right? You were not going to get even a call back. So at the very lowest levels, right? If you're trying to get a job in the United States, it seems like, I never thought about this when I was applying for jobs, but Lavendra, who the hell knew I mean, maybe I have a Portuguese last name, but it's amazing that, and this is a, Harvard study, right? So this is not some somebody cooking this up in the kitchen, but it's amazing that this has been demonstrated over and over again. Where if you have a certain sort of name, you're likely not to get a call back for a job interview.
Yeah, that speaks to the unconscious bias and whatnot
Unconscious.
that can be addressed through various techniques that either from unconscious bias trainings or blind interviews. There's one company I was reading about that did all their interviews all through chats. Like there was no face-to-face, there was no nothing. It was all through the internet through chats. And remarkably, the results that they had were a very diverse workforce from the gender, race, age, everything. Like they had people like 75. So, I think that data is exactly right, but there are, at least now we know how to address it. And I think you see many more companies, particularly Hershey is doing it as well, to address that, to either through unconscious bias training, hiring for just specific skill sets and really testing those skill sets. What really drives success in your particular role? Is it the fact that my name is Damien Atkins? No, right? But is it the ability for me to communicate in all different screens and all different mediums and different situations? So yeah, that data, and it's true in the legal profession. There's examples of, there was a study done where there was a memo prepared called by a guy named John Smith, and they put John Smith's name on it, and then they put Jamal Watkins' name on it, and then they sent it to partners to review it. John Smith's essay was great, very insightful, great, fantastic analysis, and Jamal was like, "Ah, needs to work on basic reasoning," and same memo. Same memo, right? So, and that was used to really, and it's been great that we did that experiment because it's forced change in the way assignments are doled out, the way performance reviews are done, the way hiring is done. So the data is depressing, but I think it's been good that we actually have techniques to address that, because the notions of unconscious bias, whether in hiring, promotion, reviews, or anything else, are prevalent. But we, at least in the United States, I could say that there's been a very good movement to kind of address that through various techniques and procedures.
Karthika, do you have a question? I know we have some questions from the audience also, right?
Yeah, we do. And actually, I have a question for Damien as well. Interestingly, Damien mentioned, under 35-year-olds, about under 35-year-olds earlier. And so obviously, under 35-year-olds, they've spent 8 years of their life in an Obama presidency and all, and it's a different world for them. How do you, when you hire for Hershey and stuff, do you see a difference in the types of resumes from people of color? Has that empowered them to enter the legal profession, do you think?
That's a good question. No, I haven't really seen that. I think typically, and I'm only speaking as a general counsel, but typically when you get resumes coming in for people of color or people who are not of color, all gone to good law schools. There's still kind of like the brass rings and certain career track that people do, and that is largely the same. I think the differences that you might have are, a lot of times you'll see, let me back up. No, I don't see any difference at all. I really don't. What I do see is a lot more kind of the soft skills where, the folks of the generation say, I really want to have meaning and purpose in what I do. I really want to have this happen, where it's, for my generation or a lot of generation, like, look, you got a job, like it or not, like you got to eat. So just stop about this purpose thing. So that's been the biggest difference I've seen in resumes, not necessarily on the career choices that people have made or the opportunities or anything else. It's been, I think there's a certain amount of structure in a legal profession that kind of constrains one's choices.
And earlier you spoke about gatekeepers and knowing who those gatekeepers are and being able to informally channel through them. Is it part of like privilege or the background that you can sort of fall back on to be able to know who these gatekeepers are and to have access to these gatekeepers, which potentially people of color don't have?
Yeah, so I would say there's an element of that. But just speaking bluntly here, it is also incumbent on the individual to go find those people out. Like when I began my journey to be general counsel, I had no idea who the gatekeepers were, and I took it upon myself to go figure it out. Like, so yes, it would be great, and a lot of people do have the advantage because either their family members are able to tell them, look at this firm, look at that firm. I had some of those advantages, but I don't want to discount kind of an individual initiative and going out there. Look, if you want to be a CEO, start studying how people became CEOs, right? Because I think that yes, there is a certain amount of privilege in terms of being able to be placed in the path of opportunity or insight that people might have from family or prep school relationships or even college relationships. Yep. Or those kinds of things, but at the end of the day, like, you still got to kind of put in the work and go find out who those folks are and be willing to fail over and over again before it actually happens. But yeah, to answer your question, yes, that does play a role in it, but I can't say it's such a large role that it's impossible for anyone to do it. I think a lot of times, you have to be willing to put yourself outside of your comfort zone. I don't look like most people in the legal profession. I'm not, I don't, but at the end of the day, if you have a goal, you have to be willing to go for it and take those steps. So I would book discussions with people who've already been GCs, whether black, white, man, woman, Asian, doesn't really matter. I wanted to learn. So, and, of the 10 times I would send out emails to discuss it, I might get turned down 7. That's okay. Even if that's fine. So I think I don't want to lose sight of kind of the fact that you still have to own, yes, there are obstacles and they are different, but frankly, and I'll be again, being blunt here, no one cares. So it's still important for you to understanding the landscape, understanding that there are webs of relationships that you might not have, but that shouldn't stop you and use that as an excuse necessarily that you can't do what you want to do.
But if you already have a lot of anger when you are entering the workforce already, because you feel like you've been marginalized or treated badly and stuff like that, wouldn't you feel that that would sort of affect that person's trajectory in their ability to become a CEO or,
Oh, it totally does. Yeah, absolutely, it does affect that. But again, I try to
I mean,
mentor
if
people.
you're, for example, the child of one of the guys who was killed by one of the police brutalities, your life has changed forever. How you view color and people has changed forever. So how does that person then now go and say, oh yeah, I'm going to now network with all of these gatekeepers and become a CEO?
Yeah, like I said, that say you're the child of George Floyd, right?
Yeah.
Your life has been changed forever. I don't want to discount the power of human initiative and drive and desire, right? So, because anyone began with a particular set of circumstances, I have friends of mine I went to college with, very different circumstances that I grew up with. I was very fortunate. Um, that cannot be total a barrier to doing what you want to do if you have a dream. And yes, there are people born in different circumstances going to change their outlook on, for example, of how they interact with people at work. I worked at law firms for a long period of time where we'd have other kind of African American associates working there, and oh, you want to go to the partner's house for barbecue, or you want to go to this cocktail party, and like, oh, I'm really not used to dealing with these different types of people in these kind of social settings. This is unusual for me. Well, I mean, if this is the path that you've chosen, if you want to get ahead, this is the path, and you kind of have to, take a deep breath. And if you really want to go for it, you have to take risks and you have to get outside of your comfort zone. So, like I said, I don't want to. At the end of the day, yes, there are structural impediments. Everyone's born in a different circumstance. You can't help that. You just can't. You're born into what you're born into, and what happens to you, to your parents, or it's just, you can't control that. And frankly, and I'm speaking very bluntly, no one cares. So at the end of the day, if you want to achieve something, you still have to go in and put yourself outside of your comfort zone, and yeah, go talk to that person who you look nothing like,
Right.
who you might have anything that you might think you don't have anything in common with, but surprisingly you probably do.
Yeah.
So I just don't want to say that, yes, there. Let's be real. There are those barriers out there. There are inequities in terms of access to insight and opportunities, but it's still incumbent upon, particularly African Americans and others, to, if you have a dream, you have a goal, you have a path that you want, you can't let it stop you. I mean, you got to look at it from an opportunity mindset that, look, everyone wants to stand out. Everyone wants to be different. Everyone wants to get the attention to that. So guess what? You already have an advantage. So use it. Right. So I just, and I tell this to people I mentor. I said, well, I didn't, the work is going to so-and-so because they play golf together or they're in lacrosse in school. That's fine. But you could still, what are the things that only you can do that you bring us some differentiated value to? Maybe you're good with kids, or you don't know unless you try, right? I found, some of my most powerful mentors have been older white men who, on the surface of it, I would never think we'd have anything in common, but you start having conversations and, oh my God, same love for music or art or anything else. So I think that, you can't limit yourself or can't look at obstacles, societal obstacles, as saying that I'm just going to give up. It doesn't work that way. And quite frankly, no one cares. So it's still incumbent upon you to go make it happen.
From all the statistics that we've been sort of discussing and throwing up there for viewers and for you to comment on, I think the one we started with a lot of people having friends and having conversations around this issue, having friends, and I think that's the most, for me, the most compelling of them, right? Because I think the story is that once you start integrating actually in terms of friends, family, marriage, whatever, then these barriers, sort of tend
Absolutely
to come down.
right. Personal experience.
Yeah, you don't see them as these stark polar opposites of black, white, Hispanic, all these other things. And I think that, for me, was the most compelling metric of all the data we saw. And frankly, there's a lot of negative data. I mean, everything from, impact of COVID is overwhelmingly against minorities, right? Most of the deaths are happening in minority communities, especially African Americans. When you look at the political landscape, the divide between Republicans and Democrats, and it's just huge. On issues of race, it's just, miles apart, it seems. And of course, many people don't have a very good opinion of how President Trump has handled the situation. But I think what you're saying, which I think I want to sort of come back to a little bit, is that no one cares, and it's sort of, and if you look at the numbers, it also is the same, right? It's historically, whether it was Obama who was in our power or someone else, it's just the African American experience has really not changed very much, right? So in terms of crime rates and things like that, I mean, poverty, it's marginally. So is this something that the African American community has to essentially sort of do themselves, or is there something that if you were talking to somebody who's not Black, what can they do to help the process to dismantle this or minimize this? I mean, you talked about Hershey doing various things to sort of take the bias out of the hiring. I mean, if you were to dismantle this, I mean, should this dismantling start happening by, white folk and other people acknowledging that there is racism and that needs to be taken care of and it needs to stop? I mean, does it need to start there? Because, I mean, African Americans obviously have known that for generations.
Yeah, I think all change, it all starts within, right? And I think you got to start small, and over time you have a lot of small steps, and then have a tremendous amount of impact over time. So the real way to infect change is to look within yourself and what changes can you make as an individual, whether who you spend your time with, what questions you ask of people. Are you surrounding yourself with the same type of people? Maybe have someone over for lunch or dinner, or a conversation. Someone, a coworker, typically is where you meet people who are different from you, and then just start building those relationships. That is, to me personally, is the most impactful thing, is starting within, and those small, and I call it small acts of courage. I think life for African Americans in the United States is tremendously better than it was. And my dad was 5 years old, so there's no debating that whatsoever. But I think you have to start small with action. There are small actions that over time, and collectively, if we all decided to be, talking to someone to build relationships outside of ourselves, like the younger generation has, just by definition, because of the nature of what that's when you start having those changes. Look, John Lewis just passed away. So, he was an activist who risked his life back when he was 20 years old for voting rights. That is a tremendous amount of courage. That's a huge act of courage. And his whole life was large acts of courage. Not everyone can do that, right? Colin Powell, one of my idols and whatnot, it wasn't his thing. But, if you listen and read his biography and you listen to what he did, it was a consistent series of small acts over time that had a profound amount of change in the U.S. military and in the U.S. government, right? So, you have to figure out what works best for you. I'm not going to say everyone should turn around and be the next John Lewis. I would never do that. It's not me, right? That's not me. But I do challenge myself. What are those things that I can do to help bring about more change? It could be having these kinds of conversations. Lavi, you and I met randomly, right?
Yeah,
problem
building. That's right.
Right. Yeah. So just learning a lot about different parts of the world. Just talking. So I think everyone could do those small acts of courage, saying hello, hi, those kind, to build those relationships. Also, I think you also need a sense of ownership. I mean, you're right. The data is depressing. It's been it goes up, it goes down, it changes. Presidents come and go, governments come and go, but you can control kind of your own attitudes and your own experiences, and how you decide to frame those experiences and attitudes will have a lot to do with kind of the outcomes that you have.
So, Karthik, I think we have a couple of questions. I think Danushka has a good question from.
Danushka has a really good question. Thanks, Danushka. Okay. We keep hearing about police brutality when it comes to systemic racism against people of color. Do you think it's just limited to law enforcement, or do you see it across the board? Thank you.
It's a good question. I mean, I'll speak from what I've observed. I can't necessarily say I've personally experienced this, but if you look at the data from the healthcare providers, disparity in quality of healthcare is very different kind of across racial and income groups tremendously. If you look at access to technology, very, very different in terms across race and gender and ethnic groups. So no, it's not just limited to kind of law enforcement. I think what COVID has shown that it has an impact everywhere, right? So no, it's not just law enforcement was, again, having the graphic image beamed right to you, it's been front of mind, but no, it's pervasive. It's housing discrimination, employment discrimination. It's across the board. But I do want to say that again, yes, that's the case, but no excuse necessarily not to do something about it yourself.
There's also another question that says, what are the first steps? Sorry, go ahead, Karthika.
Yes, sorry. What are the first steps towards real change that can be taken in present situation in America. And Damien, I believe you sort of addressed that by saying it's like little acts of courage and different people doing different things to address the problem for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are the things that bring about real change, are small acts of courage at scale. If there's someone, look at Barack Obama. I mean, he wanted to make change before he was president. He became a community organizer. Right? And he spent a lot of time, organizing their community groups for change in their community. Whatever that is that works for you. It could be, volunteering to coach a baseball team in a different area. It could be, some people adopt children. Like whatever that is, each one of those small collective steps will have an impact. I don't want to just get so focused on passing legislation or punishing this person's got to go to jail. And those are things that are, those are outcomes that you can't necessarily control. But I think, again, change always begins within the person.
Yeah, it's true. So in the 10 minutes that we have left, and I know you have another meeting at rush to, so I'm cognizant of your time. Have you also faced, outright racism in your lifetime as well? I'm sure you have, right? How
yeah, absolutely.
Do you deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. It just depends on, it kind of depends on what part of stage in life is in. It's different response at 4 years old, 5 years old, 10, 18,
sure, of course.
50, right?
Right.
Yeah, and it also depends on, is it really directed towards me? I mean, oftentimes when I was younger, probably in my 20s or something, I would be the guy like, oh, let's stop right here. We're going to have it out. Now at 50 is a little bit different. Look, it doesn't happen as much. I will say that, particularly from a career standpoint, those conversations about you are typically the most important conversations about you are ones where you're not in the room. So I can't really say what's going on that I haven't necessarily seen. But yeah, it happens from time to time. I still get followed in grocery stores, or, I still always carry a receipt when I go get shoes or something. It's not something that, quite frankly, it's just something that I kind of feel like it's built into my, experience. And if I let it become, the foremost thing in my mind when it happens, you feel angry about it, but at the end of the day, that's their problem, not mine. And what I can control is my response and my outlook on it. Now, clearly this person's kind of has issues, but not issues that I can solve. So you just kind of, or help with, so I'm just going to move on. It's interesting but it's funny when you see it happens to your children, a little different response. Because braids and like a gold tooth, wearing an Iverson jersey, still a General Counsel of Hershey, I would probably get a very different response, even though I'm exercising my pure human right to dress the way I want. Or if you see it in music, right? You have someone like, what was his name? Anyway, you see this in music where you have, some rappers, if they're not black, all of a sudden they win the Grammy for hip hop when the music is terrible. It's just awful. So I guess I'm not sure what the questioner wants me to say. It does exist. It is kind of the way things are in the United States. Things can be done to address it, but I don't, I'm not sure, what, other beyond kind of changing, looking within and changing yourself to really have the change, or become like a John Lewis, or, to do that. I'm not quite sure what else one could do.
You're not discounting the fact that, there has to be a dismantling of the systemic racism, because, I mean, for example, the rapper example, if you did walk in here with dreadlocks, it shouldn't really matter, right? I mean, your cultural.
But it does. Yeah, but it does, right?
The fact is that eventually people need to get to a point where, I mean, and that's the question, I guess. How do you get people to a point where, what you look like, the color of your skin, what you wear, the accent that you speak with, it doesn't really matter, right? It's your competence that matters.
Yeah, I'm sorry, 1 second. No, sorry. No, no, at some point you do get to that, but I think those are things that have to do with societal change, right? And
but how do you make that happen? How do you make societal change?
But the societal changes come through kind of changes in behavior, small changes in behavior at scale due to incentives. You can change the laws that penalize certain conduct or reward other conduct. You can do things where, allocating certain benefits on a broad scale that disproportionately impact people who are disadvantaged. Like look at the GI Bill. The GI Bill effectively was responsible for creating the middle class in the United States in the 40s and 50s, but it had a disproportionate impact on people of color as well. If you look at the generation of Black doctors, lawyers who came of age after World War II, like, my grandfather was a doctor and he took advantage of the GI Bill. And so it was a broadly based kind of government program that everyone could benefit from, and it had a disproportionate impact on communities of color because it was widely available. So I guess my point is, you can have those kinds of things that drive systematic change beyond and above kind of what you can do as an individual. But the only way to necessarily get to that is through some kind of large scale societal shock to the system.
And I think the point is, I think, our generation and the one that's upcoming, the millennials and the Generation Z, I think their perspective is completely different from us. I mean, they
Absolutely.
think in terms of one race, one human race, right? And these sort of demarcations that people seem to have tussled over are less relevant to them. I mean, they are mixing more. They're having friends from all over the world. They're communicating with each other. They don't see what the big deal should be, and in terms of these sort of distinctions or labels that we put in each other. And I think there lies more hope than maybe in our present generation, myself included, that this change could happen in that generation before it can happen in ours. Do you feel that? I mean, you've said that about your kids as well, right? So
yeah, their expectations are different, I think, which is good. They have the energy and their set of expectations of what is normal is very different. I do think, there will often come a time, with any kind of change breeds friction, brings heat, which brings friction, which brings clash. So you're going to have that you see it now, kind of in the United States going on now. But yeah, I think you're exactly right. I do have hope in the next generation. I do kind of, being kind of an old guy now, I will say that, there's change will come. It's always incremental. If you look at the United States history, you had the Civil War, then you had Reconstruction. Reconstruction was a period of maybe 7 or 8 years where a tremendous amount of change happened. And as soon as Reconstruction was over, the Redeemers took over and everything was rolled back. And it's kind of the same pattern that we have here. You had Obama was president for 8 years, and then you get just the exact opposite for when Donald Trump. So look, it's always, and this is just American history, it's 2 steps forward, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, maybe a step and a half back, but eventually kind of progresses, as Martin Luther King said, progresses towards justice.
So I think John Lewis's posthumous opinion on the New York Times, I thought was I mean, he had it seemed after visiting the Black Lives Matter monument, I think he felt actually hope. I mean, is that the hope that he seemed to have clued in on just before his passing and hospitalization, that that together we can all redeem the soul of the nation? He was a lot more hopeful than maybe what some people are probably feeling on the ground. And this is from obviously a warrior of the highest order in terms of civil rights. And he seemed to have ended his message to those that remained was much more hopeful than I think that's sort of a measure of the man as well. But I think maybe he's onto something that we've sort of peripherally discussed here, which is that the younger generation and the mores and attitudes that they are that they believe in and that they promote may have a much more redemptive value than maybe the present generation of leaders and people on all sides of the color divide, maybe, barring a few exceptions.
No, I think that's right. And I mean, I'm an optimist. I continually have hope, so long as people, have that desire to be better and to see a better world and country. I mean, absolutely. If you lose hope, then what's the point, right? Yeah. I think, and that's what drives, what drove someone like a John Lewis. It drives me as well. That, things look bad. Things could have been worse. I mean, think about it. 100 years ago, people were getting lynched with impunity in the southern parts of the United States. No one cared. You had whole towns like Tulsa, Oklahoma, completely wiped off the map in a riot. So, if you look what was going on 100 years ago to what's happening today, clearly things get better. So you have to have hope and progress. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not clear-eyed about the obstacles and the struggle that comes with that. But you have to have hope. I have hope. Without that, then things will never change. And I think that's what powered to someone like a John Lewis.
Well, thank you, Damien. I know this. I mean, this is a very interesting and sometimes contentious subject. I mean, we can debate this for a long time and have different opinions. I just wanted to, and Karthik and I wanted to just give everybody a sense of sort of, throw some data out there, have you respond to it. And I know that, if I had this panel with a whole different bunch of people, they have a whole different bunch of opinions on it. I'm glad that the debate is ongoing. I'm glad that the discussions are happening. I'm glad that the views are being expressed. We did put a slide deck together. We didn't go through all of them. That was not the intention of the conversation anyways. But what we'll do is when we do have the recording shared, we will share the slide deck for the benefit of people to peruse. It does have some interesting data points that we didn't cover today in the short time that we had. But thank you. I mean, it's always there's always an inherent risk of somebody of your stature coming and talking about a subject that's obviously in the news, and I appreciate you navigating those waters with the deftness of an attorney. Very well done. So thank you for doing that. I mean, it was for us in preparation for this. It was a cathartic moment, I think, for us. I mean, I lived there long enough, but I never understood this, I think, at the depths that I now feel it. And I think maybe stepping back out of the US, you see more than when you're actually in. And I think that's what's happened to me. I can't speak for Karthik. Karthik, I know you went to college in the US as well.
Yeah.
So,
but for people like me, I feel like the Black Lives Matter movement is sort of a rallying cry for people of color. So it doesn't matter whether you're Black, brown, or Asian. It's for everybody who feels like they're a minority.
Right.
Yeah.
And I know that,
and we just need to add, Lavi, that the photo credits and this article is from the New York Times.
Correct. Yeah. So thanks again, Damien, for taking the time, and all our viewers across the world for joining and for asking great questions as well. And thank you again, Damien. Have a great weekend. My love and regards to your family as well.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. I had a good time. Thank you.
Thanks, Damien.
Thanks.
All right. Bye.